You've probably heard the news stories about the grooming gangs of allegedly Asian men in Oldham, England. The story is horrific, but it must be talked about because it illustrates why Christians are right to build, preserve, and defend their cultures. Is England lost? And if so, what does that mean for the formerly Christian West? This episode is brought to you by our premier sponsors, Armored Republic and Reese Fund, as well as our Patreon members and our faithful donors. You can join our Patreon at patreon.com/Right Response Ministries, or you can donate at rightresponseministries.com/donate. Tune in now as we discuss this important topic. We're back.
We are back. Good afternoon, GA, as the kids are saying.
GA, as the kids say. We've got a warning for this one.
Yep.
You want to give it?
Yep. So this is going to be one of the episodes that will not be appropriate for children. We're going to talk about some heavy things going on. And just if you normally listen to, or if you let your kids listen to some of our episodes, this is not going to be the one for them. Yeah,
most of our episodes, we try to make it something that's family friendly. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's entertaining for a 3-year-old, but our church is family integrated in our worship. In other words, we believe convictionally that on the Lord's Day that families should worship together. We don't want to send kids away outside of church to a separate room and call it children's church or whatever. We don't think that's church. We think church is something that's specifically defined by God, prescribed in the scriptures. A lot of churches, sadly, there's something, it's not supplemental merely on a Wednesday night. You can make an argument for that, but it's a substitute for Sunday morning, that the parents come and they drop their children off at not children's church, but if we're honest, it's a children's daycare, a children's child care. And sometimes there are some churches, especially mega churches, where that occurs all the way up through not just grade school, but even middle school and high school, so that parents are shocked and dismayed when they find out that their kids who are now legal adults and have gone to college, have decided to opt out of attending church. And they're like, how, we didn't raise our child to do this. And it's like, yes, you did. Your child spent the first 18 years of their life never attending church at all. And the reason why it's not church is because church is strictly defined. It's the public preaching of the word, the public praying of the word, the public singing of the word in psalms, hymns and spiritual songs, and the public seeing, seeing, of the word in the two sacraments, the only two images prescribed to us by the Lord Jesus Christ, the water of baptism and the bread and wine in the Lord's Supper. And there are kids who literally, they go their whole lives, their whole childhood, without ever seeing the sacrament of the Lord's Supper administered, without ever being with their family in Lord's Day worship. So all that being said, that's a little side plug for Family Integrated Church. But our church, Covenant Bible Church in Central Texas, is family integrated. And so it's just become second nature, at least for myself, and I think you guys as regular hearers of the word, but for me, especially as a preacher of the word, to always preach in such a way, not that it's necessarily fun and happy and entertaining, but where it is appropriate. It's appropriate, at least, for young children. And so most of our podcasts, same kind of thing. Some of our podcasts, we might do some fun topics like Nephilim and giants, and then it really is fun for the 5-year-old. But most of our topics are cultural, political, doctrinal commentary, and they may not be entertaining, but they are appropriate for young children. But from time to time, there's some kind of political or cultural event that must be talked about, that we're not doing just for clicks. It's not just for views. It's not just to be edgelords, but no, the Christian faith must be applied in that particular realm. And this is one of them. What's going on in England has to be talked about. We need to apply a biblical Christian worldview. But this does happen to be one of those topics that I would not preach at least as explicitly and clearly as we're going to talk about today on a Sunday morning from the pulpit in a family integrated church. So for those of you who are watching with your family, pick a different episode. Those of you who are listening in the car, turn down the volume, throw in some headphones or one headphone so you can still hear the kids and pay attention to your driving. But this is not a family-friendly episode.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Well, what we want to do, we're not a news program. We're not reporting on the news. There are groups and podcasts and newspapers that are doing that. So we are trying to get to something about, partway through the episode. We want to offer commentary and a biblical perspective on it. But in order to set the stage for that commentary, we do have to talk about what's going on and give some details, because to just say there have been a series of rapes in England and then start talking about it from a Christian perspective, people would say, well, that you guys are way overreacting. Like, yeah, rape is bad, but you guys are way overreacting. And so given that we want to kind of let the seriousness and the depth to which some of this is going on and being tolerated and promoted by the English legal system itself, I do want to take a few minutes here and kind of set some of the events. Okay. So actually, this was all started by a series of news stories right around the new year, January 1st, 2nd, 3rd, somewhere right around there, talking about how there had been a series of grooming gangs by Asian men. And I've read a number of articles in newspapers from England, and they all said, we have to say Asian men, but when we do, we all know we're talking about Pakistani men.
Right. So every time we say Asian men, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify and you're not watching it on X or YouTube or, rightresponseministries.com or our app or anything like that, if it's not visual, just assume that every time we say Asian men, pretty much all three of us are doing the biggest quotation marks sign language with our hands that you can possibly imagine, because it's a joke.
Well, they are Asian. But like Wes said before the show, Japanese are in England. No, it is a particular
there's a flood
area.
of Japanese in England right now. They've comprised grooming gangs doing terrible things.
Yeah.
Right? No, that's not happening. Wait.
So Elon Musk, I don't know how, but he got a hold of some of these stories and some of the graphic nature, which we're not even going to read some of the extremely graphic things on the show today. But they devastated him. And the idea that there were gangs of men who had been victimizing, grooming, raping, and taking advantage of, even killing in some cases, young British white girls without consequence for the most part. There have been some, but largely without consequence. It just shocked and appalled him. And if you guys remember, like, one of the reasons he kind of went against woke was what happened to his son, the way his son was transed.
Xavier or something, I think was his name.
Yep. Yeah. And so for him, this actually kind of follows a pattern for him. He sees, okay, wait, we're doing what to kids in England now? And so he tweeted out some tweets about this. And it's interesting that the Prime Minister of England has separated himself from those tweets. He has said, that's inflammatory and unnecessary. But the tweets, because he's the richest man in the world, has the biggest platform in the world, it has set off a firestorm in the media and in social commentary. What is interesting to me is that what's going on in Oldham is not just part of a larger pattern in England. It's actually part of a larger pattern in Europe. I don't know if you guys remember, but back in 2016, there were all the sexual assault and abuse cases that happened on New Year's Eve, 2015 to 2016. This was in Cologne. And later in Berlin, there were similar outbreaks of Muslim men gang violence and sexual assault against women. And it happened in Sweden too. And if you guys know who Tim Pool is, he actually got his notoriety because he went to Sweden and he talked to people on the ground. And they said, we are not allowed to publicly talk about the fact that this is going. We'll get in trouble. The media has been cut off from this, but there is a rash of sexual violence by I think there it was more the Somali refugees that Sweden had brought in. And so this is actually part of something that's going on in a lot of Christian or formerly Christian Europe. And Elon Musk poked the bear today with a particular tweet about the statistics and the numbers in Europe. So we're going to show this tweet that he posted earlier today. I guess he retweeted it. The original tweet said, studies show that men from non-European origin commit 84% of assault rapes, despite only making up around 10% of the population. An Algerian is 122 times more likely to commit aggravated rape than a Swede, and an Afghan is 69 times more likely.
122 times more likely.
Yep.
84% is committed of these atrocious crimes is being committed by 10%.
Well,
less of the
and
population.
maybe half, although I think there are more men who have immigrated than women. But if you assume like maybe 6% of the Muslim population is men,
Right.
and 4% women, or something like that, like it's
Right.
it's even more disproportionate than
So
the
then,
10%.
yeah, that's a great point. It's it's predominantly the men that are doing this, if not almost exclusively. So then that 10% gets knocked down to 5 or 6%,
Yep.
Which means that in terms of multiples, your 122 times becomes like 140 times. Your 69 times becomes like 140 times. That's absurd, and you're not allowed to talk about these things.
Yep.
But if you have a section, a relatively small subset of the population that is endangering everyone else at a horrific, atrocious degree and level, then as civil magistrates, civil fathers, if you look at, the Puritans, Thomas Watson and different guys like that, talk about even in the fifth commandment to honor thy father, there are different kinds of fathers. There are ancient fathers, like we would honor, Augustine, we would honor Constantine, we would honor Athanasius, Origen, Irenaeus. Like there are multiple, ancient fathers that we honor. But then there are spiritual fathers, ecclesiastical fathers, even to this day. Think of your pastor. You think of those who are ordained officers in the ecclesiastical realm. And then there are familial fathers, like your literal father and mother in the fifth commandment that's explicit. But then there are also not just ancient or spiritual or familial, but there are civil fathers that should be honored as well. And you look at Stephen Wolf's conception of the Christian prince, and in our American scheme, our political scheme that we prefer. We're Americans. We think it's good. Much of our founding, there are problems, but much of our founding we view positively. Then if the Christian prince scares you, well then just add an es at the end. Christian princes. That there would be more. It wouldn't just be a monarch, but there would be multiple Christian princes. But you look at, again, back to Thomas Watson and in his, late great Puritan, his work, the Ten Commandments, on the fifth commandment with civil fathers, he describes them using some of the language that the Apostle Paul uses in sacred scripture and talks about nursing fathers, that they really have a fatherly role to protect their citizens. It's not H-1B. It's not. It's for their nation. They're obligated to their nation, and that means they're obligated to the people that make up their nation. That place, that people, that obligation towards their nation. America first. If we use our country, does not mean that America is likened to a sports ball team, and that America needs to win the next global championship, and it doesn't matter if Americans actually get any game time. We can actually bench all the Americans,
right.
AKA unemploy them, and we can go ahead and transfer in a bunch of Hindus, just so long as America wins the race for AI or wins the race for going to Mars, or wins as long as
GDP goes up.
Exactly, as long as the team wins. No, America first means Americans first. That's what it should mean. If that's not what it means, that's totally fine. You're wrong. It should mean the people of this country. And so that's the duty of civil fathers to their people. And if native Englishmen, if native Brits who can track their ancestry to that piece of land for 1,000 years plus, their daughters are literally being ravaged by a small subset of the population that has been there for less than a century, in some cases for 15 minutes, some Somalians and things like that, then what you do is you round them up and you deport them. And the ones who've committed crimes, you go even further.
You're gonna be surprised by.
Woo! Michael's gonna be based today.
No, this has been attempted actually in some cases.
Oh wow.
Yep.
Okay. Real quick, let's pause for a second. Like the video. If you are watching on YouTube, subscribe. Click the bell so that you catch every single piece of content that we put out, and like the video. Give it a thumbs up for the algorithm so that it gets out to as many people as possible. If you're on YouTube, here's the deal, right? We've got Christendom to restore. The order is tall. You need to be maxing out. You have an obligation to be online 14 hours a day with 17 different Anon accounts. No, you don't need to do that. You do need to touch grass. You need to love your wife, love your kids, be a churchman in the local setting. However, I'll dial it down a little bit. if you're on YouTube, you do need to pull out your laptop. You need to be on one platform on your phone, another platform on your laptop, and you need to go over to X. And some of you guys, you follow us on YouTube, you need to be following on both platforms on YouTube, but also on X. Go to here's the handle, @RightResponseM. Couldn't fit ministries in there, it's too big, but @RightResponseM, and go ahead and follow us. Click follow on X, click subscribe and the bell on YouTube, like both of the videos, share them, give it a retweet on X. Let's get the word out as much as we possibly can. All right.
Okay. So in England specifically, the Muslim population is about 6.3%. Actually, Pakistanis have been immigrating to England since the 1930s. So it's not just in the last 10 or 15 years, but the number and the different regions, Somalia, North Africa, Pakistan, that has increased quite a bit over the last couple of decades. At bare minimum, what we can say, and this is just the convictions that we know of, but over the last decades, there's been a minimum of about 2,000 underage girls, some very young. I mean, we're talking 5 years old.
Wow.
That have been groomed, trafficked, and even killed, predominantly throughout northern and central England.
God have mercy.
The number's probably much higher than that. These are just the ones that they've managed to have convictions on. And then the percentage is the same. The convictions, the vast majority of the perpetrators of this have been Pakistani, Somali, and North African Muslim men. It's 84%.
84%.
Even the ones that are white are part of a gang that's run by these Asian men. So even the ones that are, they fall outside of that. Yes.
Have been influenced.
Yes.
It's like having... Yep. It's like sending your kids to public school, and your kids end up doing some bad things, but part of it is they're influenced by,
Yeah.
So in every single level, like if you add that, I wonder, like with the 16%, the other side of the 84, that is part of the native population. I wonder how much lower that number would get without the influence of these foreign people who are committing atrocious crimes.
Yeah.
That basically what we're saying is, it sounds like if it wasn't for this foreign influence, and the Trojan horse of DEI and don't be a racist, and like you could almost eradicate, like virtually eradicate the entirety of these horrific crimes, which are happening. It's not just happening to the British, heads of households, like grown men in their 40s and 50s, who are, the penalty is that they're taking a pay cut, or being overlooked for the next promotion. But you're talking, literally, the equation is this simple in my mind. You guys correct me if I'm being hyperbolic, but it seems as though the equation is older Brits have a very clear choice. It's you can either be called racist by strangers who hate you, and preserve your daughters, or you can offer your daughters up as a human sacrifice to foreigners and strangers who worship demon gods, but meet your DEI quotas and be considered a tolerant person.
That's the headline of the story.
Well, on the foreigners piece too, we've talked a little bit about high trust before. That's exactly what you would expect, is those type of people, they have no grounding in a place. So I've said before, my grandma told me about growing up, and she's probably in her mid 70s. So she's not really that old. This is an America that existed within her lifetime. But she would just go to the playground at school. Yeah. Nobody would have a second thought. Go to the corner store. And why didn't people do terrible things? Right. Why weren't kidnapping so prevalent? Well, not necessarily probably because every single person was regenerate. Probably a good majority of them actually were. But even those that weren't regenerate, the mechanism that God has given to many people to help restrain the wickedness, even of unbelievers, is you take them and you put them in the same place, and then for generation upon generation upon generation, they do life together. They attend the same schools. They build up shops together. They do life, and then when you think about it, would you go to your local, this just happened in England, local dance studio and, I don't know, stab 6 young girls to death? Well, of course not. My mom used to teach there. I grew up with that teacher. These girls are the cousins or the neighbors, this, that, or the other.
You wouldn't do it because it would be subconsciously engraved into your own conscience, your own mind, that to do that would be to do it to myself. I think of Ephesians 5, and obviously that's specifically talking about the covenant bond of marriage, and so that's a more potent bond. That would be a higher degree. So I'm going to argue from the greater, but give, I think, a same principle conception to the lesser. Well, at the greater level, the covenant of marriage, which is stronger, I have a further obligation to my wife than I do my national fellow citizens. But the language that's used there by the Apostle Paul underneath the inspiration of the Holy Spirit is that that no one harms or inflicts self-harm on his own body, his own flesh, but rather nourishes his flesh. And the view there is that the body is his wife is his body. She is a very extension of himself, that he wants to lend towards her flourishing because it's his own flourishing. If she suffers, he suffers, that you're attached to one another. But when you have these in-group and out-group dynamics and in-group and out-group preferences because you've invited the third world into your country, and they haven't assimilated, and they have no intention of assimilating, but you've done it en masse so that they actually, at a practical level, don't ever have to assimilate. They can all just centralize and focus in one little tiny British, town, and they never even need to learn how to speak English because they can just talk to one another and they can prefer one another. Then they're not doing that to themselves. They're doing it to you, and it's very much etched into their consciences of this. There's us and them, But people don't degrade typically just by natural instincts because people are created in the image of God. So even apart, like Wes said, apart from regeneration, apart from a new heart by the work of the Spirit and regeneration, even fallen man, unregenerate man, but still made in the image of God, is like people are not naturally suicidal. Right? It's always a subset, a fraction of the population that would actually take their own life in a literal sense. And it's not because you have to, train people, and do years and years of counseling from the age of 3 to teach people why suicide would be bad and all these it's instinctive. Like when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, a bunch of woke, feminists, in evangelical circles have said, see, the first law is to love yourself because you can't love your neighbor as yourself if you don't love yourself. Jesus is not, he's not prescribing self-love as a prerequisite to loving others. He's assuming self-love. So he's not saying, work on loving yourself more, therefore you can love others more. No, Jesus is saying, love your neighbor as yourself, assuming that it's built into human fabric that everybody, whether they're born again of the Spirit or not, they all love themselves. You love yourself every time you eat a meal. You love yourself every time you breathe instead of holding your breath until you pass out. We all instinctively love ourselves. And so the husband-wife dynamic, Ephesians 5, is just a further fleshing out of that the wife should be viewed as an extension of the husband's self, that she is the body. And then you go further from that, the children. And then you go further from that, the grandparents and the aunts and the uncles. And eventually,
in similitude,
you have a nation.
The likeliness. We share history. We share morals. We share religion. We share holidays. Like that parade that the guy just drove the truck into. People don't do that because it's like, wait, these are the people that I've shared everything with. We live in the same land. We remember the same history. We go to the same movies. We eat the same food.
Why would I do that
share
to
a
myself?
Main street.
Right.
Why would I do that to these people that are like me?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
My people.
Well, it's interesting because even the people investigating this, that there have been investigations over time, but even the people investigating it do not want to live in reality. So I have a quote here from, this was a number of years ago, a guy who was investigating a rash of outbreak of some of these grooming gangs, and his name is Haras Rafiq. But nevertheless, he was investigating it. And so, Nate, we'll do that first quote. He said, this is at the end of the conclusion of the report. He said, we didn't want there to be a pattern of people from our ethnic demographic carrying out these attacks, but unfortunately, we were proven wrong. Now, right as soon as he said that, he says, Mr. Afzal also warned gang grooming was not the most common form of child sexual abuse. And it's like, okay, guys, they're actually, and it's true, on the books, there are more like just, individual, like an abusive father, that sort of thing. Like there's just more population of that. And so the point is, this guy's like, we don't want there to be a particular type of person that's doing that. And by the way, all those white people, like just by proportion of population, there are more sexual assaults that are not carried out by gangs of grooming. And it's like nothing to see here. And even if there was something to see here, this is not a big deal.
Right.
And it's like, well, no, this is a huge deal.
That's the same. Here's why it matters. It's the same as like when we did our episode during June of last year, sodomy month, and we gave the statistics, and we drew that, the straight line from I'm gay to I'm a pedophile,
right?
And saying not a coincidence. The statistics are exponentially higher for particularly gay men.
Right.
Scissor sisters, not as much, but for gay men, sodomites, real straight line. All right, it's a real gay line, but you get my point. Real straight line from gay men to grooming children, and what we were trying to say is perversion reaps perversion. The scripture talks about sin. You don't wake up in the morning. Everybody is totally depraved apart from salvation in Christ, which comes by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. So everybody's a sinner. And even those who are saved with new hearts, the power of sin is broken, the penalty of sin is paid, but the presence of sin still remains until the next life. When we see him, 1 John, we will be like him, for we shall be as he is, sinless, as Christ is sinless. However, in the meantime, everybody's a sinner, and the unregenerate are totally depraved sinners, but total depravity is distinct from utter depravity. You can be totally depraved, and yet still, when it comes to at the level of the heart, inwardly, total depravity, but outwardly, in terms of physical, external manifestations of sin, you can still be restrained in those outward expressions of sin because of fear. And that's a good and biblical principle. That's what Romans 13 is all about, that the civil magistrate does not bear the sword in vain, and that it keeps people in check, that even the unregenerate, totally depraved individual thinks to himself and says, there are people right now who I get death threats, but by God's grace, this could change. It's only the grace of God protecting me and my family. But by God's grace, nobody's ever acted on it. Do you know why? Because they would probably go to jail. And so there are terrible people who hate me, hate my children, threaten my children, who have never acted upon it, in large part because of fear of the sword, that it actually restrains. And so my point in all of that is that there's a straight line from the LGBT, Q plus, and you got to ask, what's the plus represent? Pedophiles, that's what it represents. There's a straight line from that to child grooming and horrific acts of being sexual predators. Now, you can't draw that with race and say there's a progression of sin straight line, but you can see patterns. My point in that is it's one thing, right? Like these days, everybody's really worried about not being anti-Semitic, or whatever. And this episode is not about that, so I don't want to get into that. We've done plenty on it, and I'm sure we'll do plenty more in the future. But I will say this: noticing has become all the rage these days. Noticing, and for those who are their greatest fear in the world is being called anti-Semitic, then they're very anti-noticing. Well, it sounds like that's precisely where this British Prime Minister
it's exactly the same
is, right? So it's one thing to where you always try to make something a pattern. John Harris did a good job talking about the dangers of ideology. Part of the dangers of ideology, and you can have Christian ideology, is it's like you just learned about Calvinism, so now everything's a nail, everything is the tulip, everything's about unconditional election or limited atonement or whatever. And it's like, oh, that's Calvinism. Or you just became patriarchal. And so everything is a problem of feminism. And that's absurd. I would say only 99% of things are related to
Please,
feminism.
I'm a moderate here.
I'm a moderate, exactly. I'm a reasonable moderate person. Or then you get J-pilled, on the whole Jewish question or whatever, and you're like, it's always the Jewish cabal, every single time, and you can track everything back, and so there are problems with being ideological. And in my opinion, one of the incentives towards that frame of mind is because it's easy. It's easy. Seriously, it's hard? Reading old, long books. Doing the reading, as they say. Doing the reading is hard. You know what's easy? 4chan. You know what's easy? Just being on X all day and getting J-pilled by whoever, and then saying, oh, I've figured out the secret to all things, and I've also figured out the true test of orthodoxy. How do I know if somebody's a false teacher or if they're faithful? How do I know if somebody's actually a Christian or not? Well, it all depends on what they say about the Jews, and it's this redactic oversimplification in reality, and it's like, well, why is that person? Well, I can tell you why. It's because you haven't done the reading. The reason why is because reading Bavinck's systematic theology is a lot more difficult than spending an afternoon on 4chan. And so my point is, there are patterns. There are patterns. We don't want to be say that this one pattern is the master key. That's what guys try to do. They try to take one doctrine, postmillennialism. I've done that. They try to take one doctrine like Calvinism. I did that too. Did my Calvinism cage stage. So one doctrine, or they try to take one pattern, the Jews, whatever, and they try to make it the master key in order to compensate for their lack of knowledge in all these other realms that also matter, because it's actually a multivariant situation. However, on the flip side, there are a lot of guys, good Christian brothers that we love, who I think are dead wrong and choosing to be part of the problem by saying that we basically, it's one thing to go look for a pattern when there's not and try to force the square peg in the circle hole and say there is a pattern when there's not. But it's another problem when there are clear patterns that you will not allow yourself to recognize, when the pattern is there and you refuse to see it. And that can be with, the month of June and gay men adopting children, and the incredibly high statistical likelihood of what happens when gay men adopt children. And you just refuse to see that pattern. And it can be equally devastating when you refuse to see a pattern of importing Pakistanis by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands into a country that is largely incompatible with their faith, their religion, their culture, and then just setting them loose on the native population of young girls. There's a pattern there also.
The thing we talked about it before too, this would be mostly more refugees from Africa, but some from Pakistan. There's not conceptions in these cultures and in these languages of reciprocity, and consent is a little bit of a egalitarian framing, but of sexual consent. It was probably about 6 months ago now, but there's these Africans and they're being interviewed. And it's like, well, what if the woman doesn't want to be molested? They couldn't fathom it. Right. Like, wait, that's what you just do. Like in these, I've read stories about these NGOs and these aid workers that go in and they're like, it's just commonplace that boys just, if they want to have sex with someone in public, they just do it. So you have people that don't even have a concept of, hey, this person might not want this. What would you think would happen? Like, how blind does someone have to be to think you could take all of these people and you can put them in there and the soil will change all of that they'll suddenly understand Western values around sex and consent and all of that. That'll just be magically imparted to them. Of course it won't. It couldn't possibly be.
Soil.
Well, there was one case in particular in England where the guy went to trial. They had evidence against him, and when he got up on the stand, he said, "I've never been taught this is wrong." And the judge goes, "Oh, okay. Well, we're going to let you go, but now you know it's wrong. Don't do it anymore."
Crazy. All right. So Michael has planned a lot for this episode. Okay. There's a lot of quotes that we want to get to. And so this is what we're going to do. We're going to go to our first commercial break. We're going to come back. I'm going to temper myself and give Michael the reins so that we hear a lot from him. Wes also has, he didn't prepare for this. And Michael and Wes, they do a lot of the writing for each individual episode. So this episode is Michael's episode. But the larger topic in general, Wes has done a lot of the reading on that. And so I want to make sure that we hear from both of them in our second segment. One more time, do us a favor, like the video. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Click the bell so that you're notified as we put out content. Our schedule, just to remind you guys, because it's a brand new year with a brand new schedule, 3 p.m. Central Time on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. 3 p.m. Central Time, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We'll be live streaming on both X and YouTube. And then, of course, you can find the live stream on our website, rightresponseministries.com, on our app, the Right Response app, and then, of course, on your favorite listening platform, Spotify, Apple, XYZ. And so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 3 times a week, 3 p.m. Central Time. That's the live stream. We've gone from once a week last year to 3 times a week. And then in addition to that, on Fridays, and we'll be kicking off this Friday, you'll have the live stream at 3 p.m., but then you'll also be able to come back at 8 p.m. Central Time for the Friday special. And that's a deep dive, multiple like 9, 10, 11, 12 part series, and it's quarterly. So there's going to be 4 seasons for Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 throughout the course of this year. And what we've decided to do, we're kicking off this Friday, is going to be episode 1, which we already launched to the public, but it's been a few months. And so we decided to pick back up with episode 1, but we're making the Isker series with Pastor Andrew Isker and myself on all things Israel, right? So if you feel like, man, you guys are avoiding the JQ in this episode, well, you'll get 9 episodes of that over the next few weeks. The full 9-part series with myself and Pastor Andrew Isker on Israel is going to kick off starting this Friday at 8 p.m. Central Time. So like the video, remember the schedule. If you can't remember it, click the bell so that you're notified. We'll go to our first commercial break, and then we'll come back and give the ball to Michael to try to get through as many of these statistics and some of the facts and the quotes as we possibly can. All right, guys, listen, huge development with our conference. This is the Christ is King Conference, How to Defeat Trash World, happening the year of our Lord, 2025, April 3rd, 4th, and 5th. That's a Thursday through Saturday. Now, we already had an all-star lineup, but we've made it even sweeter. We've got Steve Dace, Orrin McIntyre, Andrew Isker. We've added his co-host from Contramundum, that's CJ Engel. We've got all the Ogden boys, Brian Sauvé, Eric Kahn, Ben Garrett, and Dan Burkholder. Of course, we've got the Christian Prince himself, Dusty Devers, the reasonable Latino, A.D. Robles, and John Harris, the host of Conversations That Matter. But we've also carved out now space for a formal 90-minute debate hosted between Stephen Wolfe and David Reese. The debate is on natural law versus theonomy. And then we've added one more special guest speaker to the lineup, Calvin Robinson. We are super excited about this conference. 8 main sessions, 3 different panels, plus the debate. It's going to be an incredible time that we spend together. Again, this is April 3rd through 5th, 2025, and you can go to rightresponseconference.com to register today. Again, that's rightresponseconference.com to register today. Are you a Christian struggling to find companies that align with your values and beliefs? Well, then Squirrelly Joe's has you covered for all your coffee needs. All of their coffee is hand-selected and roasted fresh every day by a family of fellow believers. Try them out and you'll savor exceptional coffee while knowing that your investment supports a company committed to following God's teachings and upholding truth and righteousness, ensuring that your hard-earned money contributes to the growth of God's kingdom. Stop giving your hard-earned dollars to pagans who support evil. Right Response listeners have access to an exclusive deal. Your first bag of coffee is free. All you have to do is cover the shipping. So head on over to squirrellyjoes.com/right response. Again, that's squirrellyjoes.com/right response to claim your first free bag of coffee today.
All right, welcome back. What I want to do now is spend a few minutes and go through a couple of specific places and times where this has happened in England, where the grooming gangs, because throughout the history of the last couple decades, it does make it into the press occasionally that this is going on. It flares up a little bit like a grease fire, and it gets put out immediately. So I want to show a map, first of all, of England and some of the towns where this has been most prominently happening since mid-1990s, okay? So Rochdale, Rotherham, Oldham, and then I can't read the orange. I should have used a different color, but anyway.
Petersboro?
Petersboro, yep. Okay, now, Nate, show the next slide, please. So that green band across the middle in the north, that mostly lines up with towns. The maps are slightly different scale, but Rochdale, Rotherham, Oldham, Petersboro. Now, there's a big green population up there, and the green is where Muslims have settled in England, and then around London also. But what's what's tragic is these cities in northern and central England, where there have been the worst abuses, actually, you would think, well, why isn't it happening more around London? There's lots of Muslims settled in London. Well, what they have found actually is the houses and the centers, and it's so deep. Like there's taxi drivers in on it, and there's real estate agents in on it, and so they know when a house is vacant for a long period of time, and so they'll just go into these vacant houses, and then they'll put out ads, or not public ads, but they'll put the word out, and Muslim men from London are driving up to these towns. And so it's publicly, it's somehow advertised, they're being paid, and there's like the whole network of it. It's, well, as I'm going to share a story here in a minute, you'll see how deep some of this network goes.
Let me note too, like Rotherham, I looked at some of the demographics, like an 85% white, 80% Christian town. So you have a town that's European, white, Christian, and targeted. Like all of these towns are probably small rural towns of people that go back a long time. One of those regions where my family's from, back 800 years ago, that have lived there, loved it, raised their children, and just exported out these wicked people.
And that's what, like, that it's a particularly Christian town. That's what makes me think it's not just when you think of motives, like why? When you think, why do the wicked do what the wicked do? I refuse to believe that it's merely, I think it's this. It's not less than this, but it's more than this. I don't think it's merely sadistic sexual pleasure.
Right.
I think it's also to demoralize Christian Westerners. It's to demoralize Christian nations, to defeat them.
I was going to say this later, but it fits in now, and this is the warning for if you have kids. This is just not the episode to listen to.
Yeah, you shouldn't be. Yeah, they should have. We were clear. They should have tuned out a long time ago.
This is your warning, but there's no such thing. Douglas Wilson actually makes this point as egalitarian sex. All sex is patriarchal because there's one party that penetrates, plants, conquers, and a party that receives, submits, and accepts. So the individual sex act, there's always there's a patriarch, there's the man, the authority, and then submission. Sometimes, obviously, when that's turned up, there's a man on the receiving end. You get the points. That's all sex is patriarchal. So then take it out, but expand it and think, okay, so you have women, and who's coming in and doing the conquering, the plundering, the ravishing? Foreigners are coming in and do that. That is a weapon of psychological demoralization. The Red Army, the Bolsheviks, towards the end of World War II, they raped 2 million German women on the Eastern Front as they drove towards Berlin. It has always been a weapon against a people that you are attempting to conquer, to ravage their wives, their children, their daughters, to penetrate, to conquer, to plant, to make them bear your sons, and then parade it in front of you. We conquered you. We did this.
But you were taught, like in the public school system, just like me, like we were taught about the Bolsheviks, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like I heard very little about Nazis growing up. I didn't even really know about the Third Reich. I was never taught about that. Like Hollywood never produces a movie, about Nazis. But we were thoroughly taught about the Bolsheviks, right?
Right.
JK. All right. Michael.
This actually, it goes back to the 90s, but even in the 1970s, this was starting to happen. And so there are news stories that go all the way back where vulnerable girls living in Shropshire and Telford, they were easy prey. It's exactly what you say, Wes, where they were small Christian towns with high trust. And so it was in these towns that some of these gangs started to go in, and where people weren't necessarily worried about their daughters running down to the park, things like that. So it actually goes back to the 70s. But in the 90s and the 2000s, it escalated quickly. So in Rotherham, there was an inquiry, which is British for an investigation, where they have found that more than 1,400 victims of grooming and sexual exploitation were taken advantage of between 1997 and 2013. And guys, when we say victimization, we mean they were trafficked. They were passed around multiple, as bad as you can imagine. Okay, so these are all euphemisms. So 1,400 of them just in Rotherham from 1997 to 2013.
Which is a town, I want to say, obviously it grew during that time, about 90 to 100,000 people.
It's about 200 some now.
London,
but yeah.
This is not Austin, Texas. This is a town smaller than Georgetown. Again, majority white, majority Christian. And you would have, I'm not going to parse all out, but like that's 1 in 3, 1 in 5 girls that would have been most certainly targeted, attempted, and many successfully.
1 in 3 or 1 in 5?
There's a couple different ways you could parse it out.
Right.
You know, like every family, if you assume equality, equal part girls and boys, the size of the population, how many of them were immigrants, not. But I've heard ranges of 1 in 3 would have been attempted to traffic, 1 in 5, 1 in 10. But it's an insane figure.
It's still, yeah.
Can you? I just can't. I can't move past like the civil fathers have a duty to those citizens. It's not just some sliver of the population. 1 in 3, or the conservative number being 1 in 5. Like the leaders of this town, and then at the national level, like to not only not address the problem, but to actually turn around on the native citizens that you have an obligation to under God, and to say that you're the problem by noticing, and that makes you racist. That's insane.
Well, in Oldham, there was a 2022 report, and it found that children in Oldham were failed by the agencies that were meant to protect them. So, for instance, there was a 12-year-old girl who was raped repeatedly by Asian men, and went to the police station and to report it. And what happened was the report was taken. She was escorted into a back room. The people who were running this whole thing were part of the police department. They had their way with her multiple times all night long, sent her on her way in the morning. Her mom went to a public hearing, kind of like a city council hearing, and raised holy hell about this. The next week or the next day, she was issued what they call in England an ASBO, which is an anti-social behavior order. It's like a restraining order, but from your ability to participate in public life in a particular town. So the police were in on it. She went to the public forum. She raised a ruckus, and then the social work legal system came in, and they filed the ASBO against her, and she was completely silenced from public life in that town. I mean, that's why it's important to go through some of these details, because it's like, what is going on? Where are the fathers? Where are they?
Let me just say for a moment, it's important, I think, for Christians as we seek to understand this, and especially Americans, if we don't want to see some of these things happen here, which, by the way, if you haven't registered for a conference, I strongly encourage you to do so. Right Response, not ministries, but in this case, rightresponseconference.com, rightresponseconference.com. And this is one of the reasons why I invited Calvin Robinson, and everybody lost their mind, all the usual suspects on the Reform side, and I don't understand why. I asked Calvin to come to specifically talk, to lead an hour-long session on teaching all of us how to pray through the rosary. No, I did not invite him to speak on justification by faith alone. We obviously disagree on that, and the gospel matters, and our disagreements matter. I asked him to come to speak in a political and cultural sense, specifically on Trash World, as he, as a first eyewitness account, has witnessed this in his native land, England, and now that he's in America, for him to share his observations and takeaways from witnessing firsthand Trash World and its total takeover of his native land of England, and to give us whatever insights he might have of how to stop it here in America. And that's why I invited Calvin to come, because this episode is, and I feel like I wanted to bring up the conference because this episode, I think, is the perfect context to explain why we've invited him. And I understand that he, I've seen, and I don't want to get into the weeds with this. I think there's fine people on both sides, as Donald Trump would say, the Donald. Fine people on both sides. But there are other groups, evangelical groups and ministries that have recently disinvited Calvin. And just so that everybody knows, we are not going to be doing that. We are not going to be canceling Calvin. I will say that I was surprised. He's Anglo-Catholic. I thought, the dog and the tail. I thought that the Anglo part was the dog wagging the tail of the Catholic. Turns out that the Catholic side is much more significant than I realized, kind of wagging the Anglo. And at a personal doctrinal level, if we're talking about justification, these kinds of things, I have my strong disagreements. Calvin Robinson recently called John Calvin,
his namesake,
a heretic, a heretic, his own namesake. Yeah, exactly. Do I like that? No, I think John Calvin is great. And so obviously I disagree, but that's not why he was invited. And so the invitation stands. And also, our ministry, we're not in the habit of canceling people. We've received an immense amount of pressure. And my response to those who have given us pressure is my typical response, which is respectfully, pound sand. So
we were talking about before the show, but England is practically the center of Christendom in the West. Mm-hmm. They had an empire that spanned at the beginning of the 20th century across really pretty much the known world, from India to Africa. Our theology, the Puritans, the Westminster Confession, like it all originated from England. Like that is the core and the heart of European Protestant Christianity in many ways, more so than Germany, more than France, more than some of these other nations. And it happened there, and they're much farther off, much farther gone than we are.
So what I want to say with this, so that's why we invited Calvin in this episode, I think is, case in point. But furthermore, what I wanted to say for the English people, for, any of our listeners who are native to England, I remember when I was first, looking into some of these things and looking at, as an American, looking at my own country, but then also exploring, Muslim takeover of England and France and other places in the European West. I remember my first inclination was, this is kind of like my position was kind of it lacked I think the appropriate degree of sympathy. It was kind of, this is what you get. You turned your back on Christ, and that's true. Like England it's an apostate nation. Yeah. It was a Christian nation. It's very much an apostasy. You can argue the same for America, but just even at a greater degree in the case of England and other European nations as well. So that's true. But I think it matters in terms of recognizing who is chiefly responsible for committing this apostasy. Even when you look at Israel, it's not like anybody's off the hook. Moral agency exists at an individual personal level. Everybody, when you stand before Christ on the final day, you can't say, I had a bad, my dad was an alcoholic, or I wasn't raised in church, or, my governor, was a libtard, or what, like, no, were you obedient to the gospel of Jesus Christ or not? Did you have faith in Jesus and obedience as an evidence of that faith or not? So that's in terms of salvation. It's very much an individual basis. But when you talk about temporal things at a national level, part of what makes this so tragic, and I think that we need to understand, is, I've heard it said, in this house, we believe in elite theory. And that was one of the major developments, I think, for myself in terms of political philosophy, and also how it blends into my theological and doctrinal convictions over the last couple of years. That's a more recent development for me. But my point is, as it pertains to this issue in England, the English people never voted for this.
Right. Yeah.
This is not, the English citizens that they all got together with their sacred democracy and said, you know what, we hate Christianity, we hate Christ, we hate our heritage, we hate our native fellow neighbors and citizens, and we want to give our country over to Islam. And we put it on a ballot, and we voted, and there was a majority vote for that decision. No, this is the leaders of England, the civil rulers of England, against the sentiment and the wishes and the will of the people of England, saying, no, we're doing this to you, whether you like it or not. And that's been a big change for me. And when I think of America, and I think of are there a bunch of Americans who don't go to church anymore and who live like reprobates and who are degenerate? Yeah, absolutely. Will they be responsible as it pertains to the salvific eternal level as individuals who have to stand before Christ? Yes, absolutely. But when you look at the progression of nations that become Christian or move away from Christianity and apostatize, you look at Israel. Each and every individual Israelite ultimately is responsible for their standing before God. But the nation as a whole, the Bible puts the lion's share of the weight on kings. If there was a bad king in Israel, things were bad, and the people, their hearts would turn from Christ. If there was a good king in Israel, the people would follow suit. So if you got Josiah and he's tearing down all the high places, then the people, it may be by force at first, but the people, eventually, the law is a tutor, and it then shapes the hearts of the people, and the law of God as it's exacted and executed in a public fashion in the legal system of the people, begins to tutor and shape the hearts, and the law becomes the more conducive backdrop. The law doesn't save, but it provides the more conducive backdrop for the gospel and understanding a holy God and sinful man and the need for Christ, and more people. It provides a more conducive environment for salvation. And so whether it's Israel with a good king, or whether it's England, or whether it's America, it's not like a bunch of 1950s housewives in America, were watching their black and white television sets and saying, we love Leave It to Beaver. But what I feel like what the show is missing is just a little bit more butt sex. And if we could get that, and then Hollywood said, well, we're a Christian outfit here in Hollywood, and we really don't like it, but the bottom line needs to go up. And so I guess, we'll appease our constituents, and for the sake of the market, I guess we'll give the people what they want. No, that's not what happened. In America, we're filled with a bunch of degenerates. But it was designed. It was designed by leaders. It was planned. It wasn't just that the population with our sacred democracy voted for apostasy towards Christ. No, leaders made that decision for their various motives and incentives and reasons, and then they put that on the population. They did it through Hollywood. They did it through media. They did it through medicine. They did it through hip hop. They did it through all these different things, through all these different systems, through policies and legislation and all these different systems. And little by little, the people followed suit and became degraded. And England, I think, is much the same. What I'm saying is my heart goes out to the native citizens, not the leaders, but the citizens of England who never voted for this, never wished this upon themselves, but were actually betrayed by their civil fathers who, under God, had an obligation to their native people. And all in the name, I'm sure there were kickbacks and financial incentives and all these different things for the leaders at the top. But if nothing else, if you think of motives, if nothing else, they did it simply to be viewed as politically correct.
Yep.
They sold out their own native people. The daughters of England were given over to foreigners who worship demonic gods by an elite class at the top. And what did they get? Simply the privilege of not being called racist.
Right. It's remarkable because even some of the biological fathers, like who have gotten wind of what's going on, and they can't get an audience with the police, they can't get an audience with the civil magistrate. They have, some of them, there are cases in England where some of them have tracked down their daughters, and they have gone in and they found them while some of this stuff was going on, and they have tried to rescue their daughters, and those men, those fathers, have been arrested for being a nuisance to the public decency or things like that, and pointing out salacious claims and things that will cast aspersion on minorities and things like that. There was one girl who was a victim of this for years and years and years, and she didn't say anything for a long time. And then finally, when she turned 20, she started coming out and doing appearances on conservative TV or radio shows, podcasts, things like that. And she said that the first time she went on a show and talked about this, she had two policemen come by, and she thought, oh, finally, like, it worked. I spoke out, and now they're investigating it. And they were there to ask her why she had the audacity to be spreading these sorts of messaging about minorities and things like that. She wasn't formally charged with anything, but the investigation was into her, not into the allegations that she was making. So it's utterly stunning, and it beggars the imagination of how it could get this far. So unless you guys have anything else to say, now is a good time to transition into like why is that such, no one can talk about it, no one can mention it, no one can notice, no one can anything. In fact, you have to pretend the opposite. I think there's a couple things to say here. One, and I don't really want this to be the episode. We could do a show on Islam if we wanted, but there is an argument to be made, and Wes, you made it earlier, that the Muslim religion, in a lot of ways, especially when dealing with quote-unquote conquered nations and sinful, wicked, pagan nations in their mind, the Quran offers a lot of leeway for sexual degeneracy and sexual violence. I even saw today on Twitter someone who was trying to defend what's going on, saying, well, Muhammad said that the Quran only applies to people in civilized societies, right? It doesn't apply. We don't have to treat other nations the way we would treat our obedient, godly Muslim societies. And so there is a sense where when you're out among the sinners and the pagans, from their perspective, there is a lot of toleration for this sort of violence. What's that?
The infidel.
The infidel, yep. And the Quran even says, if you're out among the infidel and a woman doesn't cover herself like all the way to her toes, she actually is inviting sexual aggression towards her. And so I'm certainly we could learn some things about modesty from some of the Muslim countries. But the point is, when a Muslim is out among the infidel, any sort of not being covered head to toe is an invitation and a permission to engage in this sort of sexual violence and deviancy. And so there can be a lot that's said, but I think that at the bottom we have to understand this is not just people coming into our country who see the same world as us, but they can't just quite get a job. They couldn't quite connect. And so they're kind of social rejects. And so they're acting out of some sort of like, I just am not fitting in. Like these are conflicting, clashing, utterly different worldviews that are colliding. And frankly, the Christian one is the one that's weak. Yeah. No, it's the one that's bending over and taking it. Right. But we have to acknowledge that there is a worldview, cultural, even like the country that you're from, the norms and the things that are acceptable and tolerable. You don't just get to put them in the same room together, the same country together, and expect that there's going to be peace and harmony. And that is such a lie. And I don't know why it's taken Western society so long. England's not waking up. I saw someone in one of the very first comments he said, I live in England. Just today, there was a resolution in the parliament. It failed. There's going to be no public inquiry into the things that are going on with the Asian grooming gangs. Like,
I saw another MP. She said something to the equivalent of, yes, there's terrible things going on, but we can't begin to say that one group is more likely than the other.
Yes, you can.
Ongoing now, still to this point, all of the data there in front of you. One weird trick, you just close your eyes and pretend not to see it.
But part of it is, this is how systemic it is in England. The police are not allowed to write in reports physical descriptors of assailants. And so actually, it might be true that when you look at the data, you can't make that determination. Like they're not allowed to say Pakistani man. I had one study that I read, the guy went through, he said, it's literally impossible unless you go by the names. And you assume that if they have a Muslim name, that they're Muslim or from Pakistan or something like that. But he said, like, in some ways, it actually is true that they can't make these determinations because they're not allowed to report on people's ethnicity or race or country of origin or things like that. Like it cannot be factored in because it's not allowed to be factored in.
And the point is that didn't just happen in the last 5 years. So it wasn't like in 2017, a flurry of bills changed all these reporting standards. And now like for the last 5 years, we can't do anything. This has been decades and decades and decades. And I think of Reagan here in the 70s in the United States, just on immigration. Opening the floodgates, the Civil Rights Act, and the Hart-Celler Immigration Act. We're talking decades of this going on, and now beginning to realize, like, we let all these people in, and this is not working. They are not compatible. The assaults, the violence, all of this, they're going through the roof. And you can have buyer's remorse, but I'm pretty sure the third world is going to say, no take-backs on this one.
Yeah. I heard a doctor a couple weeks ago talking about neurological diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, things like that. And he said, the sad thing is by the time that someone starts exhibiting signs or symptoms of Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, that means that 20 years ago, the damage actually started happening.
Right.
It's not like you can just take something now that you're having symptoms and it's going to fix it. That was because 20 years ago, things started to go wrong and your body fought against it for a long time. And now it's finally succumbing. And in some ways, that's exactly what you're saying, Wes. Multiculturalism, it started a long time ago. And we're only now starting to see the fruits. There was an insightful quote about multiculturalism. We've talked about this a lot. This won't be new, but he put it in a good way. And he's an English writer. So I thought there's hope. Some people in England are writing and thinking in this way. So Nate, let's go to the next quote there. This is about multiculturalism. He says, I have recently written in more depth about multiculturalism and how it is based on the idea that all cultures are equal. And the worst examples of the doctrine of multiculturalism being applied, those convicted of serious crimes are excused because of their culture. In one case in 2013, a Muslim man in Nottingham who raped an underage girl was spared a prison term after the judge heard that the man had been taught, I mentioned this earlier, in an Islamic faith school that women are worthless. Here, Islamic values are being used by a judge, an English judge, to no prison sentence child rape. This undermines the fundamental principle of one law for all. And so just the idea that multiculturalism has been brewing, and you reap what you sow. I mean, like, we have compassion and we fear for our own nation, but also we just have to be honest, you reap what you sow. And this is not going to go away overnight in England.
I like
But
the
my
example.
point with elite theory is just to say that the English people are reaping not necessarily what
True.
they sown,
True.
But what their leaders have
True.
sown. Their leaders have sown bad seed, and the fruit is because it's the same here in America, same conceptually, lower degree. But Nancy Pelosi will be fine, right? Like
Right.
the Bidens will be fine. The people who make these kinds of decisions live in gated communities. They have private security. They're not going to be on the unemployment line. They're not going to be replaced with their, economically with their job. They're not going to be looted or stolen from or accosted. They're for the most part, they're immune to these things, and because they live in lives of certain privileges and luxuries. They are selling out their people. They're not selling out themselves. They're selling out their people, and there's reasons to do it for political correctness, for the fear of man, the praise of man, to be viewed as not being racist, to be viewed as being, virtue signaling. And there's also economic incentives that, you can import cheap labor, so that, my own citizenry, my own people can't afford a job anymore. But I'm able to lower the bottom line, and increase profit margins because this person from India will work for, half of the salary that, an American would expect to work for. And then how do you get something like that? How do you push that across the finish line? Well, you use language like this. You say, well, the problem is that Americans, they just watch too much TV and they're lazy, right?
Who would say that?
And they played too much sports ball, instead of taking violin lessons, and they opted out of trigonometry, and all these things. And so they, it's the American people, they're lazy. And so we're not doing this to get cheap labor. We're not doing this because, somebody from India will work for less money. We're doing it because, the next Einstein, we think is in India, and we just don't have Einstein material here in America. And so we have to outsource, not for cheap labor, but for excellence, to find our next virtuoso, to find our next savant, to find our next genius. They're going to be somewhere else. And so that's why we're doing it. We can't get to Mars, unless we have all the Hindus, because if there's anything that India is known for, it's building rockets. In America, it's not like America's, one of the only countries that's ever been to the moon. We can't expect that. So You can't expect American greatness because Americans are just too lazy when it comes to academics. And so we have to import, people from around the world who have accomplished, very little, but we'll look past that. It's because of some other exterior, explanatory power, but really they're great. They're hardworking. They have, innovation and all these things. And so, so my point is, there's a lot of different narratives. And the reason why I use that example is because, yes, I'm talking about Elon Musk, and yes, I'm talking about Vivek. And the reason why is because I want to show that even among conservatives, alleged, conservatives, it's still, they still haven't broken out of this mindset of multiculturalism. They still haven't broken out of this idea of GDP must go up, bottom line must go down, even if it means selling out the American people. And even with that, there's a worldview, there's an ideology, religion plays a factor. Elon Musk is not a Christian, Vivek is not a Christian. So there's the religious factor, that's paramount, the spiritual implications. But there is something to be said for race. Vivek is Indian. And all of a sudden, he's like diehard conservative and runs for president of the United States. And we did an episode where I said, he will not have my vote.
Right.
He won't have my vote for the same reason. Well, not exactly the same, but a similar reason for why Kamala won't have it. One, first and foremost, is policy. Godless policies that are in direct opposition to the Bible, to the Word of God. But secondly, we've never had a woman president. And as far as it depends on me and whatever little bit of power that I have, by God's grace, we never will, because it's not fitting for a woman to be president of the United States. Likewise, not exactly the same, but in a similar conception, we've never had an Indian president. And by God's grace, as far as it depends on me, we never will, because this is not India. This is America. And that doesn't mean that I hate Vivek. I like Vivek, and I hope that he can serve our country well in some capacity. But at the end of the day, you can't. People are innately bound. They have an innate obligation to their people. Elon Musk, same kind. He's white, but he's a foreigner. He's a foreigner.
African, yeah.
He's a South African foreigner, immigrant. And so it turns out at the end of the day that, Elon Musk, he said several times, like, we need to stop, illegal immigration, but we need even more legal immigration. Elon Musk is fine with if America in 50 years is no longer heritage America. He's fine if everybody's replaced. As long as he can build his robots, and build his rockets, he doesn't care, because America is not actually his team. He uses that analogy, of like nations as though they're sports teams, and you can just do trades and transfers all day long. And as long as you win the Super Bowl, then that's America first. America first just means the American sports team wins the championship. Well, one, that's a completely flawed way of thinking. But number two, he doesn't care as long as he wins, as long as America wins according to his definition of winning. He's totally fine if He's fine if America wins, even if it means Americans lose. And why? Because he's not truly an American, not in the true sense. In biblical terms, this takes generations. The general equity of the Old Testament, even in Israel, you didn't have all the rights and privileges, especially as it pertained to worship in the temple and these kinds of things, until the third generation. And for some nations, because of atrocities that nation had historically committed against the people of Israel and ultimately against their God, Yahweh, there were some nations that would not have full rights and privileges as an Israelite citizen until the 10th generation. And I believe, as a general equity theonomist guy, I believe that that's perfectly applicable today, to be able to say, you will not be a full citizen. You can come here, you can work here, you can have certain visas and these kinds of, and even that has to be drastically mitigated. But you can do that, but it won't be until the third generation, your grandchildren. If you're coming from England, if you're coming from France, if you're coming from Canada, it won't be until the third generation that you'll be full citizens. If you're coming from Somalia, we will take 5, not 1,000, not 5 Somalians in the year of our Lord, 2025. And if you do well and you're law-abiding citizens, but not actually citizens, but residents, then the 10th generation, your great, because Somalia is not compatible with America. And over time, generationally, eventually it could be. Assimilation, I believe, is possible. But it takes time. This idea that people can just touch the magic soil of America and say the magical incantation, and just, have their first slice of apple pie and watch their first sports ball game, the Super Bowl, on their big screen TV, in Texas, and all of a sudden they're American. It doesn't work like that. And here's the funny thing about it. I remember Stephen Wolf talking about this on a panel that both of us were at on Christian nationalism. But he said, when people were levying the accusations against Wolf of being racist, one of his defenses is he said, well, here's the irony. I don't believe in the Superman, the white Superman. That I don't believe that the white man can fix all the world's problems. And because I don't believe that, I don't believe that all the world needs to come and live among the white man in order, I don't think that the white man needs to export and that every single nation on earth needs to be an American colony or some kind of European colony. And on the flip side, I also don't believe that by importing in all the Haitians and by them being able to rub shoulders with the white man, that they'll magically become different people. He says, I reject the Superman mentality as it pertains to your Anglo-Saxon or your WASP or whatever. He said the conception, Stephen Wolf's conception of Christian nationalism, is not that America is a Christian nation and everybody needs to be here, or we need to export America everywhere else. No, the conception of Christian nationalism is diametrically opposed to Christian globalism. It's each individual nation needs to lay hold of Christ by grace through faith in Christ, and then that nation needs to become on its own terms with its own history, its own heritage, its own customs, its own culture, needs to become Christian. Now, obviously, a pagan nation is going to have to uproot some of their culture and customs and these kinds of rituals, but some of it will be uprooted, removed. Some of it will be redeemed. That Haiti Christianized will look different than America Christianized, and both over time, not 15 minutes, but centuries, and remaining in their respective parts of the world that God has assigned them by providence. Acts chapter 17, God set the boundaries of nations and their timelines and these kinds of things. Over time, both can be equally Christian. And I believe that both can be relatively equally, over time, prosperous. But when I say over time, I'm not talking about 15 minutes or 15 years or 50 years. I'm talking about centuries. That's the conception of Christian nationalism. That's what we're advocating for. That's the way God made the world. And one of the things that I've learned in life is it's not beneficial to go against the grain if the grain, in this case, that you're talking about is the sovereign providential plan of God. God made the world. It's his world. We function inside of it according to his rules. And globalism goes against the rules. It goes against God's rules for the world that he's made. Multiculturalism, I believe, goes against the rules. Yes, multicultural, if you're looking at different cultures in different nations spread across the world. But multiculturalism in each nation is actually, here's the irony, it literally eradicates the revelation possibility of every tribe, tongue, and nation. Every nation at that point becomes steamrolled into a one-size-fits-all, this factory setting where Japan and America and Somalia and Canada and everywhere else, and the Sudan, and they all actually end up being this equal egalitarian blend of every nationality that intermarries, and over the course of centuries, every nation is the same. They're all Christian, great, we like that, but it's not Christian America and Christian Somalia, it's just Christian globalism everywhere. And if you do that, it doesn't even make sense of Scripture. The idea of on that final day in eternity that we would be worshiping before the throne of God, not with any animus, and we shouldn't have animus now, but not any sinful animus, unjustifiable animus, but on that final day that we would be worshiping before the Lamb, and that sea of saints would be comprised of every tribe, tongue, and nation. What that implies, what it asserts, is that God, in his providence and sovereignty, is going to maintain some distinction between the nations from now until the final return of Christ. Yep. And for us to work against that is actually to work against the ultimate eschatological plan of God, in a sense. And that's silly.
You know who red-pilled me on that years ago? Far-right extremist John Piper on multiculturalism. He said, look, this actually means that there are distinct peoples, nations, tribes, and tongues. And so they can't all just be thrown in the blender and mixed together. Yep. That was, I think 10 years ago I read that and I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's go to our last commercial break. And then real quick before we do though, Michael, set out the path for us for this final. So what are the big things you want to get to? What
we're going to do is I'm going to read just kind of a smattering of quotes that illustrate how scared people in England are of being called racist. And then I want us to just maybe talk briefly about why, or just drive the point home. This is why we make such a big deal about some of these things here, because we are a couple steps behind them. But still, that has been the cudgel that has been used to subdue the nation of England. You speak out about this, and you will be called racist, right? And then, I don't know, we can choose whether we kind of wrap things up or depending on how comments are or any other points you guys wanted to make, just to apply this generally to Christian thought, the U.S., things like that.
Great. Just one more plug, because on Friday, 2 days from now, 48 hours, give or take, give in this case, but 8 p.m. Central Time on Friday, we are launching part 1 of a 9-part series on all things related to Judaism and Israel. And that's with me and Pastor Andrew Isker, 9-part series. And you can watch it drip out to the public, 1 episode on Fridays at 8 p.m., 1 per week over the course of whatever that is, 2.5 months, 9 weeks. But all that is available right now. If you want to join us as a member on Patreon, you go to patreon.com/Right Response Ministries, patreon.com/Right Response Ministries. And in addition, right now you can get the whole series with Isker. But on Friday, you'll also, and this will not be dripping out to the public for multiple months. So you would have to wait months if you're just going to follow on YouTube and X and whatever. But on Friday, right now, you can get all 9 parts on the series on Israel with me and Isker. But on Friday, just 48 hours from now, you'll also be able to get all 10 parts of a series addressing these kinds of things, like multiculturalism, like racism and what that actually means and where that word was coined and these kinds of things. And more importantly, the macro picture of Christian nationalism, the full 10-part series with myself and Dr. Stephen Wolfe will also be available on Friday, this Friday, exclusively for our Patreon members. So go to, again, patreon.com/Right Response Ministries, and you can get a 9-part series with Isker, ad-free, and 2 days from now, a 10-part series with myself and Dr. Stephen Wolfe on Christian nationalism. So 9 parts on Israel, 10 parts on Christian nationalism. A fantastic deal. Also, I want to start building up towards this because it's happening in April, so we only have 3 months. But also for those of you who are, you live abroad, you're somewhere else, but who want to be able to participate and get the content for our conference. If you join as one of our gold members on Patreon, you will be able to live stream as it's actually happening in real time, live stream every single session and every panel from our conference. The conference is titled Christ is King. Subtitle is How to Defeat Trash World. It's happening April 3rd, 4th, and 5th. That's a Thursday through a Saturday. We're just 3 months away. And so I already want to start plugging that. Not only will you get the Israel series with Isker, the Christian nationalism series with Wolfe, but you'll also get the ability to live stream our conference April 3rd, 4th, and 5th, again, by simply becoming a Patreon member. And then for those of you who actually can attend in person, these are the kinds of things that we're going to be addressing at this conference. When we talk about defeating Trash World, there will be sessions that address the absolute vital need, the irreplaceable need of preaching the gospel. You're not going to defeat Trash World without the gospel. Yes and amen. But you're also not going to defeat Trash World by doing a Jesus juke and only preaching the gospel. If an intruder shows up at my house, I don't preach the gospel to him. I grab a gun and I shoot him in the chest, Lord willing, twice, just to make sure. The gospel, when my car breaks down, I don't go in the garage and preach the gospel to my car. And so, we are going to, and I know that's foreign. Some of you guys are having a really hard time with this because you're a part of the Reformed tribe, which we are as well. We love the heritage of the Reformed faith. That is our heritage. And that is our doctrinal allegiance, is the Reformed Christian faith. But I will admit that one of the weaknesses of our tribe is pietism and unstoppable, incessant Jesus juking. And so the idea that we're having a conference that will talk about the gospel, that will preach the gospel, but we'll also do some other things. We'll probably talk about Israel. We may do a whole panel on it. We're going to do a whole debate on natural law and theonomy with Reese and Wolfe. We're going to talk about multiculturalism. We're going to talk about immigration. We're going to talk about political philosophy. We're going to talk about a lot of things at this conference, and that's really, really hard for reformed folks to grapple with, because they're like, you're holding a conference and it's not on the five solas. You're telling me you're doing a conference and it's not on the sovereignty of God. Wait, you're holding a conference and it's not the cessationism conference for the 15th time? Does not compute. We don't understand. And I get it. Because for modern Reformed folks, talking about something other than the five solas, or the tulip, or cessationism, seems foreign. But our Reformed tradition, right? Modern Reformed guys, we adopted the soteriology of John Calvin. Some of the Reformed guys were real bold and even adopted some of the covenant theology and the ecclesiology of the Reformers, right? That's real bold. A little bit too bold for my taste as a Reformed Baptist, but they did. But what we want to do is we're not graduating from the Reformed tradition. We just want to embrace the whole Reformed tradition. Calvin talked about politics.
Calvin was a political figurehead in Geneva.
This is another part of the Reformed tradition. And we want to talk about those things as well. And the Reformers, guess what? I know this one's real crazy, but they quoted Aristotle a lot.
Oh, calm down, Joel.
And they even quoted that notorious Catholic Aquinas, right? That's even worse than Aristotle. That's pagan plus Catholic, They didn't quote him on justification, but they did quote him on some political philosophy, on some epistemology, on different things like that. And so this is going to be a full-orbed. How do you defeat trash world? Well, here's the short answer. Not easily. That's how.
That's true.
Not easily. Not a one size fits all. It's not with ideology. Not with oversimplifications. How do you defeat trash world? Well, you have to start thinking in multiple categories. You have to apply the Bible to every single realm of life. You have to embrace the great Western tradition. You have to. It's a tall order, in other words, and that's why I've invited guys above my pay grade who have expertise in areas beyond my expertise to speak about things. Because if it's just on the gospel, then you know what? We'll have 8 sessions, and I'll do all of them.
Yep.
I know how to preach the gospel. But it's not just going to be the gospel. Nothing less than the gospel, but it will be more than the gospel. And this is the kind of conference I think has been missing for 50 years in Reformed circles. And so, I'm a little bit biased because I'm hosting the conference, but I also think that we're doing it for a reason. We think it's needed. And so, yes, I am biased, but I think you should go right now and stop waiting, but go to rightresponseconference.com and register. Go to rightresponseconference.com and register. And if you can't afford it, email me at joel@rightresponseministries.com, joel@rightresponseministries.com. We will find a way to help you get there. I'm talking, I'll just tell you frankly to the public right now, we'll cut half of the price off. I'll cut more than half of the price off if it's a good cause and you can't afford it. We want it to be full, right? We went, right? We sent out the messengers. The king has sent out the messengers to the well-to-do and the pristine among the Reformed tribes, and they rejected us. And so now I will go to the highways and the byways so that the banquet will be full. The banquet will be full, and if that means that I'm giving 75% off discounts to people who actually care and want to be there and don't want to see our country overwhelmed by Muslims, that actually want to see a Christian heritage maintained and preserved throughout the ages for our children's children, then we will find a way to help you get there. So go to rightresponseconference.com, register for this conference, Christ is King, and also go to patreon.com/Right Response Ministries so that you can get not only live streaming the conference, if you live in Australia or New Zealand or England.
God bless.
God bless you if you live in England. God bless. Also, if you live in England, feel free to go to Amazon and get this little ditty, Fight by Flight. You might want to practice some of that and get out of there. But But if sign up for Patreon, patreon.com/Right Response Ministries. If you live in another country, you're not physically able to attend, but you want to be able to live stream all the sessions for the conference because it's coming quick. Blink of an eye, and we'll be there April 3rd, 4th, and 5th. All right, this is our last commercial break. And then Michael is going to line us out with some really important things that we haven't gotten to yet for this episode.
Hello, this is Chuck from Private Family Banking. Thanks for joining us today. We help you make one money move in your cash flow, and it'll implicate itself into multi-generational wealth building starting the first day. We help you avoid taxation. We throw compound interest to your money. If you're a high net worth individual, you have over $10 million in net worth, we can even do more with you. W-2 workers, contract workers, business owners, it's all about cash flow and making tax-deferred gains on all of your money for the rest of your life. Don't avoid this. It's a big move. It's a great time. Click the link, get on my calendar, and we'll go over your background and what you want to accomplish, and we're going to model a program to exactly fit your needs. Chuck@privatefamilybanking.com is my email, but click the link below. Make a free discovery call now.
The danger of centralized power is often represented by the word king. As Americans, we hate the word king. Civilian ownership of body armor is about helping people to have increased power to resist tyrants and criminals. And so, Armored Republic is about helping you to preserve your God-given rights to the honor of the Lord Jesus Christ, because he is the King of Kings, and he governs kings and he will judge them. This is Armored Republic, and in a republic, there is no king but Christ. We are free craftsmen, and we are honored to be your armorsmith of choice.
Real quick, before I turn to Michael, I want to address this comment in the chat because my heart goes out to you, and there are many people in this same similar situation as you. I have people in our church that fit this description, and I want you to know that I love you. I am glad you're here, and I want to deal with our listeners, our followers, with honesty and integrity. I feel like a lot of pastors will they'll just gloss over things, and so I want to deal with this honestly. So Ninja5150 says this: Joel, I know I'm probably the exception, but I'm a first-generation immigrant from Mexico, and I am as patriotic as they come. My two sons, born in the USA, served our country honorably, and we love the USA. So Ninja5150, first, I'm assuming you're listening to this because you're a Christian. So first, you're my brother in Christ. I love you immensely. Number two, from the little bit that I can tell from this comment, you're the type of person that I can genuinely say from the bottom of my heart, I'm glad you're here. I'm grateful for your sons and their service. And so here's my position. If I had my way, you would be here, but you would not be a citizen. Your sons would not be citizens. Your grandchildren would. And you would be treated fairly as just like the general equity, the application of the civil codes to Israel. The sojourner should not be oppressed or extorted or taken advantage of. You would be treated fairly. You would be able to have fair wages. There would be less people that are able to fit into this category, less legal immigration on the whole, year by year, substantially less. But people like you, Ninja5150, there would be cases exactly like you, and you would always be my brother in Christ, whether you immigrated here or not, simply by our union with Christ by the Spirit and through faith. You furthermore would be not my fellow citizen, but in a looser sense, a fellow countryman who lives here. You would be my neighbor, and my particular neighbor in a geographic, literal sense, living in my country. I would care for you, your wife, your children, your grandchildren, and want to see your best. And yet there would still be multiple categories and not just a one-size-fits-all. You would be a part of our country, but you would be a sojourner, but a sojourner who, like Ruth, wants to bind herself to Israel. Your God will be my God, your people will be my people, and your grandchildren would eventually be citizens and voting in our national elections and all these kinds of things, you yourself would not be able to achieve in your lifetime, for yourself personally, that level of assimilation. But you would be loved, you would be appreciated, there would be no animosity towards you, you would be treated with fairness, and you and other Christians like you who immigrated, it would be less amount for sure. Millions have to go back. They have to go back. But some would be permitted to come, and we would be grateful that you were here and you would be loved. That's my position. I currently pastor a church where we have 2 families that are from Canada. The same would apply for them. They know this, and they've heard my preaching as it's come up in sermons, because we preach all the way through the book of Ezra and the book of Joshua, and these kinds of topics come up, and they know my position. They listen to the podcast. They know that they are, first and foremost, my brothers and sisters in Christ and deeply loved. Secondly, they're also my neighbors at a national level, my national neighbors, because they live here. They are residents of these United States of America. I care for their well-being. I care for their marriage, their children, all these things at a pastoral level first, spiritually, but then at a national level because they are fellow residents. But they know my position and they agree with it. That's the thing. They agree with it. They get it. They get that nations matter. My position is that they would not be able to be full citizens and would not be able to vote in our elections, but that their grandchildren would, and that it would take time to fully assimilate. In the meantime, though, they would be loved. They would be cherished. They are loved. They are cherished, first at a spiritual level as brothers and sisters in Christ. Secondly, at a national level as residents, fellow residents, but not yet citizens. Now, I'm not king of America. In God's providence, in his infinite wisdom, he's seen that not be the case. I'm sure he made the right call. And so I don't make the rules. So because that's not currently the law in America, I advocate that they pursue citizenship, right, that they actually do attain citizenship, because that's the law of the land. And I'd much rather them be citizens right than a bunch of other people who don't love Jesus, don't love America, and are just trying to exploit it for as an economic zone. And so to those families in our church, this general equity of the Old Testament and the third generation, that's not the law of the land. So pursue citizenship, and I am praying that you get it. Mm-hmm. I'm praying that you get it. And for Ninja 5150, I assume that you're probably a citizen by this point. Praise God. But in terms of moving forward, there's always going to be a million exceptions, and that's part of the problem with Western civilization. Is every time we talk about a law, we talk about a principle, immediately what's talked about, what gets the spotlight in that conversation and ultimately becomes the case study that sets the law and the procedures is always the exception. The footnote always is elevated to the headline, and then the headline is relegated to the footnote. With every single law, we immediately, if you're talking about sodomy laws, immediately it's like, yeah, but what about the friendly gay couple that that does this and does that, or if you're talking about blasphemy laws, blue laws, Sabbatarian laws, it's like, yeah, but what about this obscure example of so and so, who for whatever reason, the only way that he can make a living is if he works 7 days a week. Look, we've done that. We've done that for 80 years. For 80 years, we have conceptualized and hypothesized the exception, and by doing so, what we have done is no child left behind. We've done it in our education system, in our schools, in our laws, in our economy, at every single level. We have elevated the exception at the expense of the norm. And the cost of that is that the American people as a whole has suffered. That's what we've done. And we have traded in American excellence in order to bring ourselves down, lower ourselves to the lowest common denominator. The entire West has done that. Every European nation, America, Canada, we've all done that, and we've done it for just about a century now. At least 50 years, arguably 80, arguably longer. We have to stop doing that. So I love you, brother in Christ. Personally, I'm glad you're here. If you lived here, I would want you to come be a member in our church. We would treat you with fairness and love, just like we do all of the members of our church. But if I was in charge, and as I use my platform to try to influence policy and culture and politics outside of myself and with our nation as a whole, I am going to advocate that immigration, illegal immigration, is immediately stopped. Legal immigration is drastically mitigated. And then for those who are able to legally immigrate, I want them to be Christian. I want them to love America and love our heritage. I want them to fully assimilate. I would like to see people stop speaking Spanish, and that nothing is written in any public square, in any public setting. Nothing is written in Spanish.
What about the signs at HEB that say food stamps accepted here?
Yeah.
Saw that yesterday.
Yeah,
Don't love it.
Number one, get rid of welfare. So no food stamps. Number two, if you got to have food stamps for a while and you're weaning the nation off of welfare as you're changing policies, it's written in English. And if you can't read English, go back. Go back. This is
a whole country that speaks your language, which
that's
is awesome
right.
for you.
This is America. We are a Christian nation and we are an English nation. And people can come, but they must come and be Christian. They must be want to be eventually American, or at least their children's children, that their family, their posterity would become American. So they love the Lord Jesus Christ. They also love American heritage and want to be grafted into it. And part of that is a willingness and an eagerness to fully assimilate. Ruth does not track in on the Israelite carpet her Moabite mud. No, she literally forsakes her people, not just her gods. It's not just the religion. It's also the culture, the people, the everything. She says, not just your God will be my God, as she's talking to Naomi. She says, your people will be my people. And it's not saying your people will be my people along with my other people. In addition to, no, it's a switch. It's a trade. It's a replacing. She's saying, I am abandoning the false pagan Moabite gods. I'm also abandoning the Moabite people.
A hyphenated Israelite.
Yep, I am not a Moab hyphenate Israelite. No, there's no hyphen. I am going to be an Israelite. And out of that heart and that mindset, you have a messianic line that eventually produces the Christ. You do not get that out of Mexican American or whatever.
That story is very interesting because Naomi had two sons who died, and she told both of the wives, Ruth one and Orpah, I think the second one, and she laid it out. She said, look, this is what it means. And it's not that Orpah was saved or not, but it was, in that moment, it was a perfectly acceptable decision for Orpah to say, you know what? I'm going back to my people.
I'm going to my people.
I can't, I am a Moabitess, right? I'm going to go with them. In fact, it was unusual.
And for all we know, she could have gone back to her people without going back to her gods and said, she could have been regenerate. She could have actually adopted Yahweh as her God because by virtue of her marriage and that influence, all that kind of stuff, converted, and then said, I'm going back to my people without going back to my gods as a worshiper of Yahweh, and I'm going to work with my people so that my people might worship the true God. And that's a perfectly legitimate and even praiseworthy decision.
Right. Okay, so how did the West get to this point? Well, we've mentioned it many times. I'm going to read a couple quotes. These are from newspapers in England as some of these investigations have come to light over the years. So here's the next slide, Nate. I think it's quote number 3. So this was a report that came out after the Telford, a rash of grooming gangs in Telford, a town in England. It says the report said that the majority of known perpetrators were of Pakistani heritage and that in some cases, get this, local officials and other agencies had been wary of identifying ethnic origins. Why? For fear of upsetting community cohesion or being seen as racist. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure that there's anything that would upset community cohesion more than perpetually, methodically raping the daughters of the town. But no, let's not label the perpetrators as Pakistanis for fear of upsetting cultural or community cohesion or us being labeled racists. Right?
It has to be said almost every time you bring that word up. Racist as a word did not exist 100 years ago.
Right.
It was a German Jewish man named Magnus Hirschfeld. Wrote a book called Racism, 1938. That's the first English usage you have in it. This is not a historical term. This is not a long-standing term. It's a made-up term by subversive people to be weaponized against people who love their own.
Right. All right, next slide, Nate. This is
you have to reject the whole leftist framework.
Yep.
Go ahead.
England is no longer a majority Christian nation. Only 46% of England is now Christian. And I realize for some of our English brothers there, they're going to say, like, it's much lower than that. We get it. The Anglican Church is a disaster. But there's a political incentive now. The minority population is so large in England that there's a political incentive for leaders not to wade into this. So this was another report. It says, when the grooming scandal hit the town, Jim Dobbin MP also told me not to link the issue to Asian Muslim community because it would have an adverse electoral impact. Here is more influence of Islam influence our politics and what MPs are prepared to say in public. Many politicians have prioritized vote winning over speaking truthfully about these grooming gangs. They have sacrificed young girls for their personal political ambitions.
Wow.
And then I have one more related to this whole fear of being called racist thing. So number 5, in the 2000s, an Asian grooming gang was free to roam the streets and abuse young girls because police officers were told, get this is what they were told on record, to find other ethnicities to investigate. And a detective has claimed, it quotes him as saying, we had a massive input was the offending target group were predominantly Asian males, and we were told to try to get other ethnicities. I mean, so when the police are being told you cannot go after someone of X ethnicity because it will look bad, will get called racist, and will lose political campaigns, this is what you end up with.
That's insane.
I want to cap it all off with a quote about multiculturalism from Tim Deep. He's the same guy that I quoted earlier. So this is number 6, Nate. And this is just what we have to be upfront about as Christians. Multiculturalism, he says, is an ideology that is fundamentally opposed to Christianity. It cannot accept a transcendental source of morality and therefore resists accepting the reality of a creator God. It considers missionary activity and attempts to morally reform cultures as immoral. What we're really up against is an anti-Christian, not just competing vision of the world. Multiculturalism and the idea that all nations are the same, which we've hit on over and over and over again. Multiculturalism is a non-Christian, it's an antithetical worldview to the Christian worldview. Because his point is,
flesh that out.
I agree. If all cultures are equal, then the gospel actually has no business transforming a culture. Right? If England or if the U.S. has been influenced by Christianity for decades and centuries and millennia, and that's not better, then what point is the gospel?
Right.
What's the point of having the gospel infiltrate and percolate through and utterly transform our society? If nothing is better and nothing is worse, then there's no reason to call people to a higher way of life that isn't aligned with God's law and Christ's grace and all of the rest. Like even the whole missionary project that we love is a product somewhat of globalism, but even that whole missionary project gets undermined if multiculturalism wins the day.
Right.
Bible is multicultural. Lots of different peoples all gathered together and mixed in. And then God said, separate.
Yeah.
Establish your places.
And this and this principle even applies not just to nations and culture, but individuals. Like I remember, a few years back preaching a sermon, and I could tell that the congregation was struggling with it, but I knew that it needed to be said because I felt like the neo-Calvinists, this isn't true to the actual Reformed, tradition, but the neo-Calvinists, that had taken like Calvin's soteriology and then, kind of, warped it through like kind of, made it modern and, like Calvin plus classical liberalism plus, whatever, a splash of political correctness and this, that, and the other. A lot of those guys, which would be the majority of Calvinists today, and in a sense of overcompensating, and over attempt to somehow, hedge against the accusation that Calvinists are arrogant or prideful, which there's plenty of times that's true. But in order to do that, it became all the rage for a few decades, with the young Reformed restless movement and kind of the resurgence of Calvinism. For at least 20 years, every sermon was kind of like, well, and one of the chief beauties, it's almost as though like the most brilliant facet of the diamond that is Reformed theology is is this, that according to Reformed soteriology, the Christian is no better than anyone else. Like you didn't. Not only did you not earn, but in terms of your decisions, your choices, your actions, not only did you not earn salvation, but you didn't even make a better choice than the unbeliever to your left and to your right. You didn't even make a superior choice. So you don't even have superior decision-making faculty. It's simply the sovereign grace of God. And I understand what's being said there, and certainly there's a sense in which that is true.
Yeah, Paul said, I'm the most wretched of all men. And,
that's right. It's God's sovereign election. That's the doctrine of unconditional election. But here was my point when I preached this sermon that people wrestled with because it felt foreign to them on that backdrop of, Calvinists trying to prove that they're not prideful and arrogant, and overcompensating. The reason why that felt so foreign to them is the argument that I was making was I was saying, it's true that when you become a Christian in conversion, God is not choosing. It's true. He chooses the fools to despise the wise, the poor to despise the rich. God is not looking at the mass of humanity and picking the superior portions of humanity in order to inherit salvation. But upon inheriting salvation, so not in terms of God's election, his choice, while we are yet enemies of God, but upon no longer being enemies of God, once that heart of stone has been removed and replaced with a heart of flesh, once you're no longer an enemy of God and a child of his wrath, but rather an adopted son of the living God, then it's not just that the penalty of sin has now been paid, but the power of sin has in fact been broken. It's not just justification, but sanctification as a fruit and an evidence of justification begins to do its work. And the end result is, and this is crazy, I know, but the end result is that Christians are better than non-Christians. And we have to be able to say that. That must be true. Of course, that's true. Because to say anything otherwise is ultimately to say that the gospel is nothing more than fire insurance. It only affects the life to come, has zero effect on this life here and now. It's to render the gospel impotent. It's to say that the gospel covers the penalty for sin, but it doesn't actually have any power to break the power of sin. It is true that the Christian still will wrestle with the remaining presence of sin, but both the penalty is paid and the power is broken so that the Christian can get better. Even when I do, we do this every single day in our catechism with our children, with family worship. If you want to know some of the less political and cultural, but more of the not even pastoral, but Joel as husband and father in my private home. Some of the questions that we do in our catechism is we say, so we get to a point where we say, will God ever die? No, God lives forever. And then the next question that we do is, will you die? And the answer is, yes, it is appointed to man that he should die once, and then comes the judgment. Then the next question is, will you be destroyed in the judgment, or will you pass through the judgment? And the answer is, I'll pass through the judgment. And I do this with my 2-year-old. My 2-year-old says, I'll pass through the judgment. Do I know whether or not my 2-year-old's regenerate? No. But I teach my 2-year-old to say, yeah, you're darn right. I'll pass through the judgment because I believe it's a matter of when and not if. This 2-year-old was given to me. He's not just any 2-year-old. He's my 2-year-old. The Lord gave him to me. And I believe the means of grace are not severed from the ends of grace, and that one of the chief means of grace where God saves his elect is actually parenting, that God gives. I mean, you just look at the statistics. If you're born in a Muslim home, God saves. But a lot of times he doesn't. You're statistically far more likely to grow up and be a Muslim. Shocker. You're born in a Christian home, and you have a far higher likelihood of growing up and being a Christian. So that's the next question is, will you pass through? Will you be destroyed or pass through the judgment? I'll pass through the judgment. Then it's, why will you pass through the judgment? Because I trust in Jesus. And then we start getting into the commandments of God and obedience. And one of the questions there that's very integral is we say, what is it? The reason I started so far back is because it's a sequence, and I remember it better if I start from the beginning. But we go to the commandments. what is it? How do we glorify God, love Him and obey Him? And then it gets to it gets into why do we obey God? And it's I think the specific question is anyone good enough for God? And it's the answer is no. All have fallen short of the glory, sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And then we say with obedience, it's gosh, I'm so sorry, it's escaping me. But with obedience, it's basically, it gets to like, can anyone be good enough for God? Can you obey? Is obedience a means of inheriting salvation? The answer is, of course, no. But then I follow it up and I detour from some of the classic, the Westminster and Keach's Catechism and some of that. It's a lot of Keach's Catechism and Westminster, but I've added some of my own questions. And then I get into, so does obedience matter? And that's what I'm getting to. If we're not saved by our own obedience, does it matter? And the answer is yes. And then it's two particular reasons why it matters. I say, why does obedience matter? Is God pleased if we grow in obedience to the Ten Commandments? That's how it is. Is anybody saved by his obedience to the Ten Commandments? No. No one is good enough for God. Can we grow? That's the next question. But if we're Christians by grace, can we grow in obedience to the Ten Commandments? And the answer is yes. And then the next question is, if we grow in our obedience to the Ten Commandments, is that pleasing to the Lord? Is the Lord pleased by our sanctification even in this life, knowing that in this life, no one's perfectly sanctified? So the fullness of sanctification doesn't ever happen in this life, which means every single way that you're being sanctified, every way you're growing in obedience, it's never achieving perfect obedience. All we ever offer to the Lord is imperfect obedience. So is the Lord ever pleased? He's pleased with our positional righteousness, our standing in Christ, which comes by faith alone. But is he ever pleased by our progressive righteousness? Not just our justification. We know he's perfectly pleased in our justification, which is by faith, and that's the perfect righteousness of Christ, which is imputed and not earned. But is God ever pleased with our progression of sanctification in this life? As we grow as Christians, as we grow in obedience, never attaining perfect obedience, but improving in obedience. And the answer is yes. God, as our Heavenly Father, is actually pleased in our feeble attempts in improving, while not yet ever arriving, still improving in obedience. That's the first one is, why do we want to grow in obedience? It doesn't save, but we can grow. It is possible. And number one, it pleases the Lord. Sanctification pleases the Lord. Not only justification. Justification perfectly pleases him in terms of positional righteousness, but progressive righteousness of sanctification also pleases our Heavenly Father. The second one is, I ask, when we grow in obedience, as Christians, when we grow in obedience, does it make the world a better place? Is it more loving to our neighbor? And the answer is, again, yes. To grow in obedience makes the world a more loving place for our neighbor. So we want to grow in obedience, not because our obedience saves. Only the perfect obedience of Christ, which is received by faith alone, saves. But by growing in obedience, one, growth in obedience, sanctification, not mere justification, pleases the Lord. Two, growth in obedience, sanctification, is one of the ways that we love our neighbor. The more obedient each individual person is to the law, word of God, that's how we love our neighbor. We love our neighbor by not putting idols in his face, by not taking the Lord's name in his presence, by not stealing from our neighbor, by not coveting what God has sovereignly given to our neighbor, by not murdering our neighbor, by not committing adultery with our neighbor's wife. In all these ways, we're loving our neighbor. And so can we grow in obedience? Yes. And in growing in obedience, does that please the Lord? Yes. And so all that back to what you were saying, Michael, my point is, God doesn't choose certain people to become Christians because they were better. But when God chooses someone and makes them a Christian, that does make them better. Christians are better than non-Christians. That doesn't mean you can always do the exception thing that we've already talked about. You can find the worst Christian and then find the most outwardly moral non-Christian and compare those two and make your Reddit argument, as a James Lindsay new atheist. That's fine. That's cute. But if we want to be serious people, adults, then you have to look at the group dynamic on the whole. On the whole, regenerate Christians morally superior in terms of outward behaviors? Are regenerate Christians in general morally superior to unregenerate pagans? If you can't answer that question with a resounding yes, then you're not being humble as a Christian. you're actually being accusatory and indicting God as having an impotent gospel that is mere fire insurance that covers the penalty of sin, but is impotent and powerless to do anything about the power of sin. And it's the same for nations with cultures, which are simply the comprisal of outward behaviors and customs and rituals and actions. That's what forms a culture. If you have a Christian nation, you have a Christian culture. And a Christian culture beats the hell out of an Islamic culture or a pagan culture or a Jewish culture. And if it doesn't, then what are we doing? What are we doing? Like, I feel like the response to this, in the chat should be, shocking news update. Joel believes that Christianity is true. Shocker. Joel thinks that Christian pastor says that Christianity is positive for the world, right? Like, of course we believe that. And so what do we, yes, we want the gospel to spread to every single Christian nation, but we don't want every nation to come here. We want the gospel to go out and for nations to become Christian. And when they do, those cultures will become better. In the meantime, until that happens, those countries that have less Christian cultures because they have not been Christian nations for centuries and centuries, those are worse countries. They're worse. It's not everything's the same. Oh, it's just different. It's a distinction without a difference. No, it's a distinction with a difference. Somalia is not a great place to be. Not by comparison to these United States of America. Haiti is not a great place to be. And people will get cute. Again, the Reddit atheists will say, well, I just Googled the religion in Haiti, and it's whatever, 93%, Catholic Christian with a syncretist mix of voodoo. And it's been that way for 15 minutes.
Right.
I'm talking about countries that have been Christian since King Alfred for 1,000 years and arguably 1,500 all the way back to Constantine. So, nana boo-boo. Oh, I got it in the chat. Christian pastor says Christianity is positive for culture. Shocking. So yeah, so it all matters. Back to you, Michael.
Nope, that's it. I mean, so the really where we were landing is where I was hoping that we would get, and that is just this idea that there are forces that are at odds with a Christian worldview. And we've mentioned this a lot before, but that battle is not just a battle in the church over doctrine. Right? That battle is over what is real and what is not. And I think that when people look back at this time in history, because reality will win, what they'll say is this was the time when people tried to say reality is not real on a whole host of issues.
Gender.
Yep.
Race,
The whole 9 yards.
Everything.
Yep. And so, that's why I think you said it earlier, Wes. There's optimism, right? Like this cannot continue. It's not a matter
One way
really.
or another.
What's that? Yeah, one way or another, nature is going to win. The way that God has created the world is going to exert itself. There's no arguing with that. What's that?
Nature is healing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Andrew Tate is running for prime minister in the UK.
Really?
And he's great on there will be no boats coming in, boats leaving daily, taking people out, attackers, perpetrators, rapists, they'll rot in prison. We're going to live stream it. But man, why couldn't it be a Christian? That's how impotent we are.
Yep.
He's a Muslim. Pimp.
That's what I was going to say. I've seen some of his takes, and some of his takes actually are good.
Yeah. He'd be better than the current one.
Sadly, which is
some
sad.
level.
But he would be a drastic improvement. And that's not to say much of Andrew Tate. That's to say very little about the current administration in England. But yeah, I've seen some of his takes, and there's some good stuff. But the glaring, terrible, sad, tragic irony is the dude's a Muslim.
Right. It could have been Christians. We've had the Christian kings, the Christian princes, the Christian prime ministers. We've had them. It could have come from our stock. And we just sold the boat.
Well, not only
Pietism,
that, but the
impotence.
reason he converted from Christianity. Now, I mean, obviously, we know biblically that's testimony that he was not regenerate.
Sure.
But the point is, he was so unattracted to the weakness in Christianity that he went to something else that was stronger. Like even on that, he, who's now a Muslim, himself said, "This. There's nothing here."
Right, because he was just a secular, not non-religious person, and then he started realizing, started waking up like a lot of people, red pilling on this and that and the other, and started realizing, whoa, we need to go back we need something ancient, tried, true, tested, and secure. And, humanist, secular, mumbo jumbo ain't it. And so he was like, so basically it was like he was at a crossroads and was like, I need a religion. Religion is ultimately what humanity has ascribed to since its birth for, millennia. And I need a religion. And I'm sure he considered Christianity. But the reason he ultimately didn't choose Christianity is because Christianity is fake and gay. But not inherently.
Right.
It's a pseudo, fake, shallow Christianity that has become that way. But if Andrew Tate, when he was making this decision, if he would have been able to talk to the Christians of old, he would have been like,
Right.
Richard the Lionheart.
Yeah, if he was sitting down with Duke Godfrey and then Muhammad and deciding his
Right.
he'd be like,
Right.
Muhammad is super gay and also a rapist,
Right.
the very thing I'm trying to stop. And Duke Godfrey is a man. This dude is amazing,
Yeah.
and I guarantee you, Tate would probably have chosen Christianity. So, all right, that's it. I hear my family outside. They're saying, Dada, you are done. So, again, subscribe to the channel. If you're watching on YouTube, click the bell so you'll be notified with all of our content as it drops. And go ahead and follow us on X. The handle is @RightResponseM. @RightResponseM. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. We will see you again on Friday at 3 p.m. Central Time. And also make sure on Friday to carve out some time if you're available, if you're interested, for episode 1 with me and Andrew Isker on all things Israel. That will be the Friday special, which will be 8 p.m. Central Time this Friday. God bless.